Well, hello everybody. Hello again. I'm going to try to do something a little bit different here in the wrap-up talk. Laura asked me if I would try to bring some of the themes from the conference together, which is a really difficult challenge, knowing as I did that so many really wonderful speakers were going to be preceding me as I did this. So I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here and see how it goes. One thing that is interesting to me about the history of wars, and one reason why I wanted to get interested in studying them, are both the intended consequences of wars and the unintended consequences of wars. The ways in which wars leave behind, the ways in which they break pre-existing patterns and kind of shuffle decks in ways that some people are unable to see, and as I hope to show you here, some people are able to get the general outlines of. And this is a particular case in the First World War, as we've heard a little bit here today, when Europe in 1914, and by extension much of the world in 1914, was governed by four empires: the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Russian. Now, even people in their time period who disliked these empires, even people who believed that they were, quote, on the wrong side of history, unquote, or that they were going to go away, those people didn't actually think these empires were going to go away anytime soon. Then by the time you get to 1918, 1919, not one of them, not two of them, not three of them, but four of them are gone. So it really is a moment when the world has to be remade in some way. And what I hope to do is show you how the United States ends up in this mess, both intentionally and unintentionally. We talk a lot, we use it as a throwaway line, that the First World War put the United States on the world stage. What I'd like to do here in the next 45 minutes or so is explain how that happened, explain some of the complications that come out of how that happened, and explain that the ways in which that happened were not the ways that Americans had expected. Now, I use as the image to start this a painting by a man named Stuyvesant Van Veen called the Paris Peace Conference. He painted this in 1932, and as you can see, here are the statesmen of the world talking, while the war continues to go on in the background. It even says war to end war is literally feeding the machine gun with bullets as rivers of blood come down into the speaker's stand here at the bottom of the auditorium. Now, obviously, one of the things that he's trying to articulate here by 1932 is the ways in which the First World War has not created peace, the ways in which the war has, in fact, created greater levels of violence. When we periodize the First World War, as beginning in 1914 and ending in 1918, we sometimes miss the point. And recently, historians like Thomas Weber and Robert Gewarth in Europe have pointed out that this war didn't really end for most people in Europe until the late 1920s or even later, a point that Eric made, of course, about Russia. But it's also important to note that for many peoples in the world, this war created the conditions that will create violence in the 1920s by shattering old systems without ever really putting anything substantial in their place. Now, Van Veen was born in New York City. He is an American. Although I do need to point out here, as you probably can guess where this is going, he spent 3 years living in Pittsburgh, where he painted the famous Pittsburgh Panorama, which are the murals that are in the Pittsburgh Courthouse and the Federal Post Office, both in downtown Pittsburgh. And one of the things that he was, of course, interested in, and one of the things that I'm interested in, is the way that wars have these unintended consequences, these vast unseen changes, and the ways that the world is changing around people. And in this particular case, this is a challenge to the way that Americans were thinking about, the way a political consensus was beginning to develop in the United States in the 1920s, that the country could or should go back to the status quo ante. Try to go back to the relationship that Americans had with the world, either pre-1914 or pre-1917. And as I hope to show you here, that has changed. That is now impossible, even if it took Americans a little while to figure that out. This is William Lynn Westerman, a symbol of this great transition. This is him in the years roughly before World War I, and if he doesn't look like a mild-mannered professor to you, I'm not really sure what one would look like. In the summer of 1917, he was a professor of ancient history at the University of Wisconsin, a native of Belleville, Illinois, and a specialist on Egyptian papyrus scrolls. Like many educated people of his time, he was educated partly in Germany at Humboldt University. And then in September 1917, he is asked to join something called the Inquiry, which somebody mentioned, I think Jennifer mentioned in the roundtable a couple of days ago. The Inquiry is this kind of first think tank. They become the Council on Foreign Relations in the 1920s, a group of people that Woodrow Wilson brings together to help inform him about all the parts of the world that the United States is now involved in. Wilson famously said to the inquiry, "Tell me what is right and I will fight for it." Let's figure out where right sits, figure out what it is. And Westerman ends up on this group. Here they are. There's Westerman in the box up there. Sitting in front of him right there is another man who's going to become very interesting to me, a man by the name of Isaiah Bowman, a geographer who later became president of Johns Hopkins University, and he became Franklin Roosevelt's key geostrategic and geography advisor. One of the many things Roosevelt asked him to advise his administration on was to help him find, and I'm quoting here, a dumping ground for the Jews of Europe. And Bowman is going to be deeply involved in a project to find the right geographic space to dump Europe's Jews into after the end of World War II. Now, Westerman is going to become later a pretty renowned guy in and of himself. He's going to move on to Columbia University, where his papers are. He's going to become president of the American Historical Association. But in 1917, he is this mild-mannered professor reading Egyptian papyrus scrolls. Now, what's interesting to me is what he is by December 11th, 1919, a strange date to pick. But on that date, William Lynn Westerman, this mild-mannered professor born in Belleville, Illinois, is in London having a conversation with British diplomats to make a critical decision about whether the city of Constantinople should go to the Greeks or whether it should go to the new Turkish Republic. And if it's going to go to the Greeks, where should the new Turkish capital go? To me, this is fascinating. In the span of about 2 years, he goes from sitting in an office in Madison, Wisconsin, reading papyrus scrolls, something that it's hard to imagine anything more disconnected from the First World War, to literally being in the room as they're making this decision about who should get the strategically critical city of Constantinople. One of the English diplomats, a man by the name of Lionel Curtis, told him that Britain couldn't do it. Britain couldn't make this decision on its own because, quote, "The British have no new energy for developing backwards people. We have more than we can handle," end quote. The United States, therefore, Curtis argued, needed to come in and take some responsibility. He asked William Westerman, this professor, could the United States take a mandate for the Dardanelles, Constantinople, Armenia, and parts of Western Anatolia? This to me is incredible. I don't want to be asked what color pencil people should write with. And this is a professor being asked about the future of millions of people. Now, Westerman knew that the United States had not declared war on the Ottoman Empire. He knew that the United States was not bound by any agreement it had not signed. And he also knew that it was not American policy to break up the Ottoman Empire. Further, he knew that the United States had a lot more power than it had information on these parts of the world. He wrote in his diary, "No one knows just what is in the president's mind beyond vague phrases and beautiful ideas." Oh, I'm going to go back. Can you help me please up there? There we go, that's what I want. Okay, this is one of Wilson's vague phrases and beautiful ideas. This is point 12, of course, of the 14 points. The Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities, which are now under Turkish rule, should be assured an undoubted security of life and an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development, and the Dardanelles should be permanently opened as a free passage to the ships and commerce of all nations under international guarantees. Now, let's forget for just a moment the vagueness of the ideas, the vagueness of the phrases that are in here, defining what the Turkish portions of the Ottoman Empire actually are, deciding how to assure autonomy, autonomous development, all of these things. There are other enormous problems. The United States had no interest and no plans in getting involved in the Middle East at the end of the First World War. Yet there is Westerman in the meeting trying to figure out how the United States would do this. Also in these discussions, Westerman is asked what the United States will do in relation to the future of Syria, another place he'd never been to. So what's driving this? What is pulling the United States into these conflicts that the United States had avowed it wasn't going to get involved in? And I want to highlight just three real quickly here as we move through the next half hour or so of this lecture. One is the point that the British diplomats had said to Westerman, that the United States was the great world power almost by default, almost faute de mieux. The British and French didn't have the energy to maintain their own societies at the end of the First World War, let alone to really have the kind of impact on some of these new parts of the world that they wanted to. Second, as the fine historian Erez Manella has pointed out, is the universalist message that Woodrow Wilson is putting out. If you're going to make these claims that the war was a war to make the war safe for democracy, if you're going to make these claims that the war was done in order to remake the world, you cannot shrink back from the difficult decisions that will come as a result of that. Now, as I'll show you, we figure out a way to do that, but it's difficult to do. And the third is the American need to develop an alternative vision both to British and French imperialism and to Lenin's own anti-imperial message. There has to be a positive American message coming out of this, and there has to be action behind it. So even if the United States did not want explicitly to be involved in some of these discussions, they were in it whether they wanted to or not. And I'm reminded of the comment that Wilson made to his propagandist, the CPI director George Creel, in Paris, when it kind of dawned on Wilson that he had made promises to everybody. Wilson said to Creel, "I am wondering whether you have not unconsciously spun a net for me from which there is no escape." And that to me is classic Woodrow Wilson, taking the blame to somebody else, but at the same time softening the blow with the word unconsciously. Now, the other problem with this is that the United States has to figure out how to deal with the already existing plans that the Europeans have put in place. And John discussed the Sykes-Picot Agreement beautifully yesterday. So just to come up with it really quickly, the idea, the division of the Ottoman Middle East into really 5 zones. The blue zone, which the French will annex or govern directly, I should say. The British to govern directly here in what they called Mesopotamia. Area A to be under French influence. Area B to be under British influence. And then this bizarre kind of area they're going to call Palestine, and we'll figure out what to do with that down the road. Now, the Americans are angry at 2 aspects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. One is that this appears to be the old way of doing things. This is the old British-French imperial, cut the lines, draw them, and we'll just split everybody up. The other thing, and John alluded to this yesterday, they are also angry at the fact that most Americans find out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I think all Americans find out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement when the Bolsheviks uncover it in the Russian state archives, because Russia was initially a party to these discussions. The Americans find out when the Bolsheviks release it, which to the Americans is a double insult, that we don't find out from our allies that you've done this, we find out from the Bolsheviks. So the Americans are angry at the concept. They're also angry at the way that the concept is put forward. They're also angry at the way that the Bolsheviks are able to make fantastic public relations out of this. See, we told you it was an imperial war. This is evidence that it's an imperial war, and the Americans are just another in a long line of imperialists. Wilson, of course, was also unwilling to take Lionel Curtis's bait that the United States ought to respond to the Sykes-Picot Agreement by taking its own mandates in parts of this map that hadn't yet been divided up, especially in Anatolia and especially in Armenia. So the question for the United States is, should the United States allow the British and French to get away with this? Remember Mary Roberts Reinhardt's warning in 1915 that I articulated yesterday morning, that Britain and France would try to tie U.S. power to British and French state interests. Is that what's happening here? Is the United States being drawn into an agreement to which it was no part of the discussions to create? Does the United States now have a role in figuring out what to do? Or has the United States found itself caught in a bind of its own making? There are plenty of Europeans who turn to the Americans and say, hey, you're the ones that urged us to act on Armenia in 1915. You're the ones who told us that we couldn't just turn a blind eye. The problem is still there. Are you Americans now going to turn a blind eye? Did you mean what you said? All that stuff you said about the Armenians. Don't just talk, act. Come in here and take over the mandate here. Take over the mandate for parts of Anatolia and help us get the successor states to the Ottoman Empire on as solid a footing as they could. Now, neither Westerman nor Wilson nor many of his advisors is quite so sure. This man is really not quite so sure. This is General Tasker Howard Bliss, another Pennsylvania native, educated at Bucknell College and West Point, and a man that William Westerman called, quote, the ablest man in Europe and the one commissioner who will really study and study hard to make himself acquainted with what he must know. Bliss is an interesting guy, incredibly insightful, a man that used to relax by pouring a glass of whiskey and reading Livy and Thucydides in the original languages. This is a smart man. His letters to his wife, where a couple of the quotations I'm going to give you here come, are incredibly and deeply insightful. I think Bliss is one of the few people in 1919 to understand that it is impossible to go back to the world of 1914 or even the world of 1918, that the world has changed tremendously, and that the United States and the world would have to change with it or risk the consequences. David mentioned Hugh Scott, another thoughtful American Army officer. Like Scott, Bliss is almost completely ignored by President Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference. Wilson doesn't make time to meet with him. Bliss has a very difficult time getting his ideas into the inner circle. Bliss was far less sanguine about what American power could do in a situation like the Middle East. He also understood that the United States had no interest worth fighting for in that region. Now, this is going to change a little bit in the 30s and 40s as the massive oil deposits in Saudi Arabia will become known to Americans. And as some of you may know, after he left the Yalta Conference, FDR, though a very sick man, did make the time to go to Egypt and meet with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia to begin to forge a relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that lasts until this day. But in 1919, Bliss saw this as a hopeless part of the world and a place where the United States would get involved at its own peril. And you can see what he wrote to his wife here. When it is all said and done, the United States will find that the European allies have gotten or taken for themselves every oil well and gold mine that there may be in Asiatic Turkey, and we will be asked to take a mandate for whatever pile of rock and heap of sand may be left. I hope that we will have sense enough to keep out of it altogether. And working where I work at the U.S. Army War College, it's interesting to me throughout history to look at the number of times when it is the soldiers who are saying, don't do this. Our army's not built to do this. We're not supposed to go into a place like Armenia and govern it. That's not what we're built for. Now, Bliss also, however, saw the essential dilemma. The United States would have to do one of three things. It would have to wash its hands of the dilemma, which is actually what Bliss hoped the United States would do. It would have to give it to the Europeans in something that looked like Sykes-Picot, or it would have to support the creation of an Arab Federation, which I'll talk about in just a bit. All three of these came with a gigantic risk. Again, Bliss is aware of the way that the First World War is pulling the United States into situations where it has to make decisions it doesn't want to make. It has to make decisions that, as we like to say in Carlisle, are not good decisions, they are less bad decisions. He could also see some scenarios where American action and American involvement could make the situations much worse. This is what he thought was happening in the successor states to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Bliss wrote that the new states in Eastern and Central Europe were not virtuous simply because they were new. They were not virtuous simply because they were ethnically homogeneous. And he described the new states of Eastern Europe as mosquitoes, vicious from the moment of their birth. And in one of my favorite letters to his wife, Bliss says that the best thing the United States could do is take the surplus weapons that they were selling to these new countries and put them on the ships that were returning American troops back home, and then when you get halfway over the Atlantic Ocean, dump all the weapons into the ocean. So not so good for the environment, but what Bliss did not want to do was to use American weapons to fuel what he expected would be the next round of conflict in Eastern and Central Europe. Better to just get rid of the weapons, write off the loss, and move forward. Now, again, it's really difficult for people to envision what the Middle East is going to look like in its post-Ottoman phase. The Ottoman Empire had been running the show there for a really, really long time. So the questions of what the post-Ottoman Middle East ought to look like and what role the United States ought to play in this part of the world are, of course, questions that we have been trying to answer for the ensuing century. And I have a colleague at the Army War College, I don't know if John would agree, who refers to the wars we're fighting in the Middle East right now as the wars of the Ottoman succession. That is, we're still trying to figure out what political system of organization will replace the Ottoman Empire. So I'm aware that this lecture may produce some frustrations, it may prove unsatisfying, and it may raise a lot more questions than it does answers. But what's interesting to me is that those questions are first on the table in this time period, in 1918 and in 1919, in a way that they never could have been, say at the time of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, when no state, not even Russia or Great Britain, had set the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire as a policy goal. Now, 5 years later, not only has that become a reality, the United States is involved in picking up the pieces. This photograph is, of course, Emir Faisal, a member of the Hussein family, the Arab revolts that occurs in 1916. He is at the Paris Peace Conference being advised by a British officer in Arab headdress, that is T.E. Lawrence, the famed Lawrence of Arabia. They are both there to push the Hussein family's claims to be the leaders of a greater Arab federation throughout the post-Ottoman Arab parts of the Middle East. And of course, we're still feeling the effects of the decisions that were made in those days in 1919 and in the years that follow. The main theme, of course, and a theme that most historians of war need to spend a lot more time thinking about, is that making peace is an awful lot harder to do sometimes than it is to make war, figuring out what to do with the vase once you've broken it. Now again, here's Bliss again, speaking very poetically. Bliss described the Middle East as a string of different colored beads, with the Ottoman Empire as the string that held them together. Now the string, he knew, had to be cut, but once you cut the string, the beads were going to roll all over the floor in disorder. And this is what he wrote in October 1919 to his wife. It seems that certain promises were made to the Arabs in the early days of the war, and now they are so unkind as to insist on these promises being fulfilled. The consequence is a grand triangular row, by which he means Britain, France, and the Arabs, with insistence on the part of the Arabs that the matter be arbitrated by the United States. I myself have declared that I would not touch the question, even with a pole long enough to reach from here to Syria, unless I were positively ordered to do so by my government. This becomes the question: is the United States the more or less neutral arbiter in this dispute? And if so, should the United States get itself involved? Another question raised by Erez Manella in his brilliant book, The Wilsonian Moment. His central argument is that people throughout the world, including in the Middle East, could read Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric and believe, of course, that it applied to them. Now the United States has made all of those promises. And I don't think that Tasker Bliss would be all that surprised to learn that we're still in the Middle East 100 years later, and that it is an even more complicated part of the world than it was even when he was trying to deal with it. It also reflects, I think, a strand of American anti-imperial thinking that some of our speakers have already discussed, Sean and Sage primary among them. Now, for his part, Faisal was trying to draw the United States into the Middle East. He told Westerman that he had not freed Syria to make it French. He was now ready to let the blood run out of his body to free it from the French. And Westerman is fully convinced that Faisal is the next great leader in the world. And he says, voila, oddly using French, great is Lawrence and great is Faisal. I am a convert. Now, at the same time, however, Westerman, like most members of the American political establishment that were thinking about the Middle East, didn't have a very high regard for the Arabs. Westerman described the Arabs as, quote, like children, pleased at notice, vain and superficial. There's a little bit less, I think, of the romanticism that the British and French had for this part of the world. To Americans, this isn't part of a great crusader past. This is a dusty, dirty, strange, impoverished part of the world. And I think John may have mentioned Twain's Innocents Abroad, and Twain describes the Middle East in incredibly negative terms. A place of thieves, a place of dust, a place where the great Christian holy sites have fallen into disrepair, not a place that Americans should have anything to do with. Nevertheless, Westerman's solution is to follow Faisal, to make Faisal, and I'm quoting here, an Arab George Washington, to put him in charge of a federation of Arab states throughout the post-Ottoman Middle East, and for the United States to be his sponsor and his backer. Westerman agreed that there were no easy solutions to the Middle East, but that the United States should become involved in the region because it was better positioned than the Imperial British and French, and it was a chance to prove that the United States actually meant what it said. It was also a way to put some teeth into the 14 points, to show the world that American rhetoric was more than just rhetoric. Now, then as now, American commitment to the Middle East was partly rhetorical. No one in 1919 envisioned sending large numbers of U.S. troops to the region, nor was a place like Syria of sufficient risk to the United States to risk breaking with the French. Now, we're going to get lucky here in 1919. We're going to get very lucky. The British come up with an idea to create a commission that would go to Syria on a fact-finding trip and, shock of shocks, ask the Syrians, what do you want the post-Ottoman Middle East to look like? Now, as you might imagine, the French were livid. One, because they knew that very few Syrians were going to express this mythic desire to be back under the control of the French. And two, because no similar fact-finding trip was going to Mesopotamia to find out what the Mesopotamians wanted, or for that matter, going to India to find out what the Indians wanted. Nevertheless, this will give the United States enough distance to pull back from Syria temporarily. Faisal, by contrast, was so elated that he drank a glass of champagne, the first alcohol he had ever had. The result was a war between the French and the Syrians that further divided the Druze, the Christian, the Sunni, and the Shia communities of this part of the world apart. France made the decision to take the mostly Christian coastal regions, break it apart, and create another political entity that it called Lebanon there, away from Syria, a decision that we're still dealing with. Faisal later went to Iraq, a history some of you know, a place he had never been to. A plebiscite found that 99% of the people in this country wanted him to be their king. I'm sure it was fair and open. The new state of Iraq put together a mostly Kurdish province, a mostly Shia province, and a mostly Sunni province into one political entity that Faisal would rule. Arabia, which was really the core of what Faisal wanted, went instead to the House of Saud, who nevertheless mistrusted Great Britain and opened up avenues of discussion to the United States. Faisal's brother, as some of you may know, was given the kingdom of Transjordan, where his descendants still rule as heads of the Hashemite family in Jordan. This is what Westerman said. The net result in Syria is another bit of poison, which will rot the Near East until the distant day when the Arabs and all the East shall definitely discard the unjustified assumption of Westerners embodied in the formula of white man's burden. Bliss made a similar prediction, that Western meddling in the Middle East would lead to a rise of Islamic fundamentalism and a rise of anti-Western violence. Syria, of course, 100 years later, remains that bit of poison, with no answer in sight and no obvious role for the United States to play. Now, the United States did not entirely step aside. In 1919, Wilson helped to create this thing called the King-Crane Commission, named after the two people who were the central figures of it. The rumor was that Congress was going to insist on Theodore Roosevelt being one of the commissioners until Roosevelt died unexpectedly in January of 1919. It would have been really interesting if Theodore Roosevelt had been on this commission. The report itself was given to the White House one day before Wilson's stroke in Pueblo, Colorado, so it's not clear that he ever read it. And most of the results of the King-Crane Commission don't reach the light of day until 1922. It came up with 4 major recommendations. One, that the Middle East was not ready for self-determination. You can't trust these people to govern themselves. At the same time, it rejected the Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And it said that Palestine should be part of a greater Syria, with the United States, not France, running the show as the mandatory power. And finally, it made the argument that the United States should help create an Armenian and a Kurdish state. Now, as I said, this report doesn't become public until 1922. It's an interesting kind of study in and of itself. The papers of this commission are at Oberlin College, where somebody really needs to do a dissertation on them. But it did lead to a renewed sense of interest in this part of the world. In the 1920s, there is a massive expansion of Christian missionaries, businessmen, and official U.S. representatives that go to the Middle East in the early 1920s. This is a group that Robert Kaplan has collectively called the Arabists. These are people who will mostly go on to oppose American policy toward Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 1940s, and then oppose U.S. recognition of the State of Israel in the 1940s. All right, depressed enough? I got one more case study. Now, David mentioned this in the Q&A at the end of his talk this morning, and that is the Shandong Peninsula, which is here in red. The Shandong Peninsula had been, for the most part, an area of German economic concession. That is, most of the economic assets there were controlled by Germany. Now, during World War I, Japan took over the responsibility of military operations to defeat the Germans in Shandong, and then they just stayed there. So there is a possession is 9/10 of the law problem. However, the Shandong Peninsula is indisputably Chinese. It is 99% ethnically Chinese. It is the home of Confucius, and it is an economically really important part of China. Moreover, as David also mentioned in the Q&A, China had made the decision to join the Allied side in World War I and had sent those tens of thousands of laborers to the Western Front. Therefore, it seemed obvious, beyond any shadow of a doubt, beyond any question, that the Paris Peace Conference should give the Shandong Peninsula to the Chinese. Now, interestingly enough, there are people who are saying the Paris Peace Conference shouldn't be dealing with this question at all. Yet it's another one of these questions that they feel they must resolve. So the United States, which had no part in the Chinese-Japanese conflict during World War I, a very bizarre one, where they're both on the side of the Allies, yet at the same time fighting each other, the United States nevertheless finds itself involved in this dispute as well. Now, it should be obvious that it goes to China. There should be no doubt that it goes to China. However, there are 3 factors pushing against it. One is that Japanese diplomats had done something very clever. They had put in the demand in Paris that the Paris Peace Treaty, whatever treaty came out of it, should include in it a racial equality clause. And they knew that one of 2 things was going to happen. Either Woodrow Wilson, the British, and the French were going to reject a racial equality clause because of their own racist views, or they were going to accept it, right? You got two choices. If they reject it, the Japanese can do what they do in the 1920s and 30s and say, look, the people in Europe really do think you're inferior. We need to reorient this system to an Asian head rather than to a European one. Or the Allies would accept a racial equality cause, in which case the very basis of their empires would begin to come apart. It's very clever, it's very tricky. Wilson, of course, had no interest in anything that would look like a racial equality clause, so that put more pressure on Wilson to give something to the Japanese. Second, the Americans and British and French needed Japanese help, they believed, to begin to balance out the Bolsheviks. A strong Japanese presence in the East, remember the Russo-Japanese War, could serve as a way to keep the Russians from focusing too much effort on the West. And I see Eric shaking his head, so that's a good sign. And third, Wilson believed, as did many of his advisors, that no League of Nations would work unless Japan was a part of it. Therefore, you had to give Japan something. So this debate is starting to swirl around Paris, and rumors are going around left and right, and I love this headline. Wilson may speak on Shandong, or he may not. And the rumors that are beginning to go around in Paris are that Wilson is inclining toward giving the Shandong Peninsula economic concessions to the Japanese. And when rumors of this begin to work their way through the American delegation in Paris, people go crazy. Some of them actually do resign, others just threaten to resign. Now, Tasker Bliss, being a soldier, being a general, resignation's not really what he does, but this is what he wrote to his wife. I've never seen such a glaring case of secret diplomacy. The outrageous yielding to Japan on the Shandong question could never have happened if it had not been done secretly. The protests of the world would have prevented it. Thank God my skirts are clear, whatever that means, or at least my conscience is, of any of the wrongdoing. Now, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that when Wilson made the decision to support Shandong's economic concessions going to Japan, that is the moment when people like Bliss, when people like Westerman, and I'll show you a couple of other examples here, really begin to lose their faith, not just in the whole Wilsonian vision, but in Wilson himself. The United States was engaging in exactly the kind of secret diplomacy and horse trading that Wilson had decried in point 1 of the 14 points. Okay. This is what Wilson said about the Shandong decision. It is the best that could be accomplished out of a dirty past. And this is Bliss's response. It can't be right to do wrong, even to make peace. Now, some of you may know, Japan gets the German concessions for 5 years. There is a hope inside the American delegation that maybe the League of Nations can begin to chip away at those concessions. And this decision is incredibly unpopular everywhere except Japan. In the United States, it's incredibly unpopular. In Europe, it's incredibly unpopular. In China, it begins a couple of days of rioting called the May 4th movement against Japanese in particular, but also European economic and political symbols throughout the major cities of China. This is a picture from the May 4th movement. If you go to Tiananmen Square today, there is a major monument to the May 4th movement, which the Chinese consider one of the founding events of modern Chinese nationalism. Now, in Paris, Chinese students living in Paris heard about the Shandong decision and literally surrounded the hotel where the Chinese diplomats were staying, so they could not leave the building to sign the Paris Peace Treaty. So they could not affix China's imprimatur onto this treaty. Now, the diplomats themselves didn't really like it either, and they argued that since we have no orders from our government to sign, we're under no obligation to sign. So China's not a signatory to this treaty. It is incredibly unpopular. It's also a case, as I try to remind folks all the time, the idea that people have that, well, if something like an Arab Spring comes up, you just shut down the internet. Without Twitter and Facebook, they can't do anything. This decision is announced in Paris on May 3rd. The rioting begins on May 4th. Without Twitter, without Wi-Fi, without Facebook, without hashtag May 4th, and it worked, right? So we need to be careful. Technology is not always the easy solution. And of course, this sets up many of the problems that are going to occur in East Asia in the period in between the wars. So I'm afraid there is no high note or positive note on which to end this lecture. A lot of Americans left the Paris Peace Conference incredibly angry and incredibly disappointed with what they had seen. I think it is less the war that disillusions Americans than it is the failures of the peace process and the legacies that it leaves behind in the 1920s and into the 1930s. Americans believed, as I argued yesterday, that they had done what they needed to do on the battlefield, They now believe that whoever you wish to blame, Wilson or the Europeans or whoever you wish to blame, had taken that victory, won by American blood, won by American treasure, won by American men and on the battlefield, and had thrown it away. And here are a couple of examples of that right here. William Bullitt, who would later go on to become the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union, when he heard about the Shandong decision, he wrote this to his mother: "I'm going to go lie in the sand and watch the world go to hell." We had a chance, he argued. We had a chance to do something positive out of all of the trauma, all of the strife, and all of the sacrifice of the First World War, and we blew it. Now, he argued, the world is going to go to hell. And some of you that know the history of the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles will know how many people walked away believing that all this did was set up the next war. Ferdinand Foch, who's painted on the walls here a couple of places, Foch said in June of 1919, "This is not peace, this is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by 3 months. And here's Bliss. What a wretched mess it all is. If the rest of the world will let us alone, I think we had better stay on our side of the water and keep alive the spark of civilization to relight the torch after it is extinguished over here." He was writing from Paris. "If I ever had any illusions, they are all dispelled." And part of what we later call appeasement is an attempt by people in the 20s and later into the 30s to try to make some concessions to a peace agreement that they knew was awful. Even when they signed it, they knew that it was awful. So, how to wrap up a talk like this one? Well, here we go. I am reminded of the famous statement that Colin Powell made in regard to another American military operation in the Middle East. He said, "There is such a thing as a pottery barn rule for international relations. If you break it, you bought it." In other words, if you have a hand in disrupting a political system, you have an obligation to try to put a political system back into its place. Now, this is an interesting case because the United States was not directly responsible for the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, nor was it directly responsible for the Japanese-Chinese conflicts that went on during World War I and after it. Most Americans, however, understood that they had to play some sort of role, despite the fact that they hadn't been the ones that broke the vase. Americans looked at France and Britain as out of ideas, out of power, and as trying to go back to a system that didn't work before and couldn't work again in the future. They also saw, and David highlighted this nicely as well, they saw Russia and Japan as presenting really terrifying alternatives to an American presence in the world. They saw the growth of Bolshevik power, the growth of Japanese power, as really threatening alternative visions. So even if the Americans tried to ignore this fact for another generation, and even if many Americans wish that it were not so, the United States was now fully, if not always enthusiastically, a part of an international security environment from Syria to China to Russia and more, a role that we continue to play a century later and that begins here in the aftermath of the First World War. Thanks very much, and let's see what you have for questions. John's going to ask why there's no Navy involved in this. Aren't you? You are, aren't you?
Well, it's absolutely involved, as you know.
Yeah.
America has a Black Sea fleet.
Yeah, but not in the talk is what I thought you were going to ding me on.
Have you gotten a chance, Mike, to take a look at all of some of these naval players, Josephus Daniels and Mark Bristol and these guys?
No, I haven't yet. I'm going to have to go down to D.C. and look in the Washington Navy Yard and see what their part in all of this is. I'd be surprised, and John, maybe you and I can talk offline, I'd be surprised if their views of things are radically different from what I'm seeing from Bliss and Westerman. Maybe they are. And maybe the key here is that they're more focused on the Pacific than they are in the Atlantic, which may well be the case.
Well, I think instead of being offline, I can give you a sense of just review the manuscript.
So we will take that on a microphone later. Next question is going to come from the gentleman in the pink shirt. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much for your presentation today. Just a what-if question. If the Shantung Peninsula went back to China instead of to Japan, how might things have been different?
So what-if questions, I like to say I don't answer in an academic setting. I answer it if there's a scotch in my hand. So you have to, as an academic, I'm not real comfortable with what-if questions because if the First World War demonstrates anything, it's that nothing goes the way you think logically it ought to go. My sense is there would have been conflict in East Asia anyway, but my sense is there would have been a little less disillusionment about America's role, and there might have been a greater level of trust among Americans about its role in East Asia. The Chinese might have seen us as a more trusted agent. It's also true the Japanese might have seen us as a less trusted agent, but my sense is the Japanese don't come away from this believing that the United States can be trusted. They believe the United States can be manipulated, and that's a very, very different thing. But the simple answer to a what-if question is I'm not ever sure, and I prefer to keep that away. I prefer to have documentary evidence. I'm an historian. I got to have paper in front of me.
Nice. The next question.
Again, I think this is a very important question. Americans since 1914, or around that time period, have not been able to make a choice between China and Japan as who should be the dominant role taker in that area. Why is that, and can we overcome it?
So I think the first thing I would argue, is that it's a false dichotomy. That is to say, China and Japan are both East Asian powers. It's not really the case that they're both East Asian powers. I mean, that has to be accepted. The second is, I really try to push with my students away from this notion that it's our choice to make. Right? I mean, this is a balance of power issue, of course, in East Asia. It's complicated by the issues in Korea. It's complicated by all kinds of things. But China's rise, Japan's rise, the rise and fall, don't always have to do with factors that the United States controls. So I guess I would urge, if I were talking to people, and I do talk to people, although I'm not an East Asia specialist by any stretch of the imagination, I would urge us not to think of this as a zero-sum game.
Thank you, Dr. Neiberg, for another home run this morning. You always do a great job. In my teaching days, I used to try to make a point with students that there's no worse time to try to make peace than immediately after a war.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that the worse or the longer the war is, the more expensive it is, the more complicated it becomes because there's so much debris still in the air.
Yep.
So my question is that for all of the obvious errors that were made in the immediate aftermath of the war and the Peace of Versailles and the other peace treaties, was there a misplaced optimism on the part of Woodrow Wilson that perhaps the League of Nations would eventually get around to addressing the critical errors of the peace settlement, and that therefore we're not going to make permanent mistakes as a result of this peace settlement? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if David is still here, but not far from where David works, just across the street in the Liddell Hart Center, Basil Liddell Hart, the British theorist, wrote pieces in the interwar years in which he made exactly that case. He said one problem with the First World War is that as the war went on, the more societies invested in the war, the more they had to demand in the post-war peace, which made it harder than any peace could possibly stick in the post-war world. So Liddell Hart recognized exactly that problem that you're articulating. I think there is a tremendous hope among not just Wilson, but a broad swath of American society that if you had something like a League of Nations, even if the United States had to moderate its relationship to that league, that the league might be able, through arbitration, to solve some of these problems. I don't think there are many people in America that think the league is going to solve everything in the way that I was just working in Ralph Bunche's papers in the incredible faith that Ralph Bunche had in the United Nations. I don't think it's quite there. But there is a hope, and I think David had Elihu Root in his trip to Russia. Root won the Nobel Peace Prize for his ideas on binding arbitration. So it's not that they think that the League of Nations is going to be this perfect thing that's going to solve everything, but they're hoping that the League can institutionalize some of these ideas, and that will, I guess, incentivize states to cooperate rather than to conflict. But I really love your first point. The worst time to make peace is right after a war, because the energies and the emotions are so heated. And of course, it happens in Britain, where David Lloyd George runs the elections of 1918, the so-called khaki election, where they return a majority that wants a really, really difficult peace. And Clemenceau is an expression of that as well.
Thanks for much more food for thought. Great talk. I worked with two Balkanists, Charles and Barbara Yelovitz, in grad school, and we heard nonstop that the Versailles Treaty was the worst peace treaty in human history.
Yeah.
Bar none, zero. And yet, Margaret Macmillan came along about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to say that, hey, this is the best we could do. It wasn't that bad. It liberated a lot of people. And what would you have done? So I wonder where you fall on that spectrum.
That's an
Assessment
easy
of this-
question.
Yeah.
You know, I just did a small book for Oxford Press for their very short introduction series on the Treaty of Versailles. And what I really argued in that book is that there really are two treaties of Versailles. There is the actual document that they write up, and then there is the life that it immediately begins to take on almost as soon as the ink is dry. The actual Treaty of Versailles is a weird document. It actually argues for gender equality in wages. It ranges far and wide. The mistake I think it made is in ranging far and wide. That is, it took on questions of, literally, that it says that women should make the same amount of money as men. And again, this is an attempt to undercut Bolshevik arguments and all kinds of other things. It talks about returning African skulls to Britain that the Germans had taken. I mean, the document itself is crazy. Special interests. The Brazilian government gets special rights to sell coffee to the Europeans. I mean, it's crazy. And I think that's part of the problem. Every one of these issues that they decide upset some major group. And of course, as your professors noted, this is especially true when you're drawing national borders. So the book, the Potsdam book that Matt was kind enough to mention, they did the exact opposite. It's Britain, it's Russia, and it's the United States in 1945. Nobody else gets to come in. The Poles get to come in and make a 15-minute pitch of their case, and then they are shuffled not only out of the building, they are shuffled out of Germany. So they do it very differently, and I think this is why. They are aware that the Treaty of Versailles just kept, well, if we're going to decide this, we got to decide that, we got to decide this, and we got to decide that. Every time you do that, you upset people. So I think the world of Margaret Macmillan, both as an historian and as a person, but I think that you can easily look at the Treaty of Versailles. Even the people who put it together realized what a disaster it was. And I think that itself speaks volumes.
Delightfully, I have the microphone, so I'll say this is the last question. For historians and for audiences, it's always easy to look at the negatives. As you end our conference, 1917, America joins the war, are there a handful of positives that come out of that for the U.S. And our interactions with the rest of the world?
I mean, I think there are people who are really, really pushing, really, really struggling to say, what can we do in this world that is so imperfect, in this world that is so dangerous, in this world where peace and security can go away in a second? There are people who are genuinely trying to say, how do we work within this? So my friend Gerard Barry in Ireland has written a book on kind of Catholic communities that try to rebuild Europe in the interwar years. Gustav Stresemann, there are these diplomats who are trying to envision a way to build a better world. There are people of goodwill who are trying to figure out how you move forward. And since I said I wouldn't answer a what if, I'm going to go speculative anyway. There is a way to read the 1920s as being relatively positive. That if the global economy had held together, if the European system had been healthy enough to resist fascism, it's easy for me to envision a way, I'm not 100% sure of this, but it's easy for me to envision a way in which the 20s and 30s look a lot better than they do to us in retrospect. That it didn't happen that way is a reminder of just how complex the world is.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Michael Neiberg.